Okay, you guys, now for the controversy between these two books. I previously mentioned that they're on delay to get to the top of Everest. They're coming back down, um, and the incident happens at the top of the Hillary steps. Scott Fisher has a conversation with Anatoli, along with some people standing around, including John Krakauer as well as Adams. Um, and the question is was Scott Fisher, did he authorize Anatoly to go back to base camp in order to prepare the way for his clients to make tea, in order to rest himself so that he could make a climb back up the mountain in case anything went bad? Or did Anatoly descend the mountain before or without the consent of his lead guide. And after this book was published, there's been kind of both of these books have been published. There's been this huge brouhaha between the two camps on what happened. Numerous, I believe that there was a conference that was held maybe in Calgary where they started shouting at one another, and it's just essentially a point that there's no conclusion on that they refuse to acknowledge or not. So, independent of whether Scott Fisher told them, uh, told Anatoly to go down, Anatoly being the Tiger Woods of the mountain of Everest, the guy that if shit got really bad was going to be the guy that was there that was going to get him out. He was really probably even among all of the expedition heads and all of the other guides, he was probably the best. Um, at least in terms of climbing, he was the best. He was maybe not the best guide, but he was the best climber. But in any case, it's undeniable that Anatoly went down the mountain and went back to base camp. So essentially, what happened is Scott Fisher's camp kind of got strung out a little bit. Um, Maybe in when the storm, and that's really the turning point of the story is when the storm came in. But when the storm came in, maybe they were too strung out, and if they had kept kind of a tighter formation, maybe the skills of Anatoly could have really come to the forefront, and there might not have been quite the tragedy that there was. Um, the other thing that John Krakauer maintains that the climb says is irrelevant, is that, well, he said that he should have been higher on the mountain, but the big reason he had to go down, that he not just chose to go down but had to go down. I think Anatoly wanted to go down to rest himself up and be able to go back up to help his clients. But the other reason he had to go down is that he really didn't have a choice. He was one of the very first people to the top and was not using supplementary oxygen as per his personal ethic and personal choice. And even if you're the Tiger Woods of mountain climbing, you can only stay at just a human body can only stay at that high of elevation with that little oxygen for so long. So you had these slower clients that if he was going to stay with them, he really needed to be on oxygen himself in order to stay up that high that long. But that was against his personal ethic. Now, Anatoly did mention that oxygen can be both a help, but it can also be a hindrance. Because if you have your lead guide that gets on oxygen, the body regulates itself in order to be on oxygen at that elevation. And if oxygen runs out, the guide will essentially be in as worse or as bad a boat as his clients, because even though he's good, his body won't be used to it and he'll be stuck up there with the problems just like everybody else. Um, to me, that seems a little irrelevant because he had to go down the mountain anyway. So it would be better if you just maybe did it without oxygen and then had some auxiliary amount of it to help you out, which actually Anatoly did. He did have some backup canisters that he didn't use, but rather than use those canisters at a high elevation when he saw that his clients were going slow, he decided to go back down the mountain. Um, Back down to base camp 4, which is still at a really high, really dangerous elevation, but it is at least is lower than anything near the summit. Um, so that's sort of the key point of controversy between the two books. As per the other guides, I want to specifically talk about how Rob Hall and Scott Fisher got in trouble. Now Scott Fisher was a world-class climber, but ironically, or not ironically, tragically, I guess, on this event, he was one of the slower people climbing up to the top. Now, how can this happen? He's, great. Well, it's speculated that Scott Fisher had gotten a parasite at some point in something that you can't get rid of immediately in his intestine. And much like, I don't know, something like herpes, sometimes there's just no effect at all, but then it can flare up. And the thought was maybe this parasite had been flaring up and weakening his, stamina as he was climbing up the mountain and making him one of the slower climbers, even though he was acknowledged as a world-class climber. So, again, he's in the danger zone. I'll talk about what happens to him in a bit. Rob Hall did not have any of those problems. Rob Hall would have been able to get up to the top very quickly, but in the spirit of getting everybody to the top, because you want the highest success rate as possible with people paying this much money, he specifically dragged, I shouldn't say dragged, that's disrespectful, but he specifically encouraged Doug Hansen, who was not a wealthy client, but had kind of raised funds on his own, had tried the year before and had failed very short, I think like a few hundred meters south of the summit. He encouraged him to reach the summit much later in the day, and they did reach the summit. But unlike Scott Fisher, who got, when the storm came in, got caught at a little bit lower elevation, but still above Camp 4, Rob Hall and Doug Hansen really got caught at a very high elevation. There was also quite a bit of controversy because I mentioned the Southern Step, I believe it was called. The balcony. The balcony is the small area where the Sherpas had cached a bunch of oxygen. But they probably didn't cache enough of it. There was some back and forth between between Mountain Madness and this other group. I'm going to find here in a second. International Commercial Expedition. International Commercial Expedition. Anatoli was actually in charge of getting oxygen. And he had this really good new canister that was very light and, pounds being very important for how much you're dragging up. You want as less possible and you need all the stamina you can. Out of Moscow, but this international expedition, I believe the International Commercial Expedition, had a monopoly on this, and the only way that he could buy canisters was at a higher premium through this secondary group in order to allow them, to be honestly, to get a cut of the deal in terms of buying these canisters. And so the thought is maybe Anatoly bought enough canisters of oxygen, and not just Anatoly, but the whole Mountain Madness guided expedition had bought enough canisters of oxygen in order to make everything work if it was on time. But we already know that there's delays, there's a storm coming on. They had enough oxygen if things were under good condition, but under bad condition, they just didn't have enough. Let's see. So, I kind of mentioned why Rob Hall got caught. I mentioned why Scott Fisher got caught. There's also Andy Harold Harris. The reason I mentioned the oxygen was he got caught high on the mountain because at the balcony, he was the one that was tasked over the radio to bring some of the oxygen that was still left at this cache up from the balcony to the Hillary Step to Doug Hansen and Rob Hall, specifically Doug Hansen because he was dragging on things. So, unfortunately, what happened high on the mountain is they tried to send a couple, once the storm came in, they tried to send a couple expeditions up to uh, get Andy Harris, also known as Harold, I think that's his nickname, Rob Hall, and Doug Hansen. But because storms persisted, um, they essentially expired at the top of the mountain. Doug and Andy, or Harold, we'll just call him Harold. Um, I'll call him Andy. Let's go by his name. Doug and Andy, they don't know the way that they expired. A lot of times when you get truly confused, you'll just walk off the end of a cliff. Um, Rob Hall survived much longer. He still had the radio on them, and in one of the most jarring incidents, he was still able to, still somewhat cognizant, even though it was kind of, you know, it was, well, this is really kind of a sad way to put it, but cognizant in the sense almost like you can talk to somebody, but they're extremely drunk. You know, like you can make your points and you can they understand, but they just can't really. Rob couldn't get himself off the top of the mountain because of the storm, because of how much frostbite he had, and he just was exposed. I mentioned earlier that you don't want to get caught overnight. Well, that's exactly what Rob did, and he survived to the next day, but the storm was still going on, and they actually plugged him in, or took the radio and transferred him into his wife on a phone in New Zealand, and they actually this is getting me a little emotional. They talked before he eventually expired of exposure. So that's what happened high on the mountain. As they're going down, the rest of the group, I believe the rest of them made it down, but it was just the degree to which they made it down. Two of them, did I say Scott Fisher? Rob Hall. Rob Hall was the one that died high on the mountain. Scott Fisher got a little bit lower, got below the balcony, but him and Makalu Gao Ming Ho, the Taiwanese leader, who was the only Taiwanese person this high on the mountain, essentially kind of got stuck in one spot. When the storm was going on, they needed additional help to get themselves off the mountain. Now, this is ironic because they're both team leaders, but they had just experienced more exposure, and a lot of it's just chance. The cards did not go against them, so they essentially were stranded. Now, luckily, they were high enough that a team was able, a Sherpa team led. See, I can't remember which Sherpa it was, but the Sherpa team did make it up to him and was able to get Gao Ming Ho down. And they had originally, they could only do one at a time just because of constraints. And Gao looked like the better one, that they could make it. And Scott was still alive at this point. And they were hoping that they could get him down quick and then come up with a little bit larger crew and get Scott down. But by the time they got up there, I believe the second time, this is really sad, Scott had essentially been locked in. And what that is where you're still alive, you can still feel like breath, I think it is, and maybe like a pulse. But your whole body has been exposed to the cold and the altitude so much that you essentially just get like locked in place and you can't move. And when that happens, it's just, a matter of time of counting down the clock until you pass away. So that's how Scott passed away. This is when the bravery of Anatoli comes through. John Krakauer had gotten down the mountain, as well as some of the people that had already been turned around, and a few that had made the top two. I think where's that guy's name? Martin Adams. I think Martin Adams was one of the few. Martin Adams was one of the few people that made it to the top and made it down without being caught in what was like the group that was really the most harrowing moment for Anatoly on the mountain. So what happened is that this well, first of all, I should mention the story of Beck Weathers. Beck Weathers did not, make it to the top, but partway up, essentially went snowblind and had to be led down the mountain. And so he actually stood in this one spot until the rest of the crew could go up and come back down, and then he was going to join them to go all the way down. John Krakauer actually remembers specifically passing him on the way down, but because Beck Weathers wanted to be guided by, I believe it was Scott Fisher, maybe? Yeah. No, it would have been, it would have been Rob Hall. He wanted to be specifically guarded by Rob Hall or Mike Groom, who was the third member who was not high of the adventure consultants, who was not high on the mountain. He wanted to be guided by one of them. He waited on them, and so he just waited and waited and waited. Well, eventually kind of a crew gathered together. I can't remember all the specific details, but it was a number of people. I believe it was, I know I am going to get this wrong. I believe it was Beck Weathers, Yasaku Namba, Stuart Hashbeck had already, Hutchinson and Fishbeck had already gone back. So those two, and then, Weathers, Namba, Mike Groom, Neil Bedeman, who was the third leader of the Mountain Madness crew, as well as Sandy Pittman, Charlotte Fox, and Tim Madsen, and I believe maybe Lean Gamelgard was with that group too. But essentially what happened is they made it all the way down to Camp 4, where it's still bad, but if you can get to the tents, you'll be protected. But remember I said that this group was on, or this camp was on an area about the size of 2 football fields. And by the time they got down, it was night, it was negative 40 degrees, the weather had turned where the visuals in front of you were a matter of feet. So they actually got all the way down to where Camp 4 was, but did not get to the right part of the double football field, if you will, in order to get themselves into the tent and help. So this is when Anatoly really comes to the rescue. He knew by the time that he had got down, the weather had turned, it had turned dark, that things were in a bad shape. And so he went out wandering onto this double football field, putting himself in great risk too. You know, he could just as easily get lost or succumb to exposure. A number of the other people that had already come down did not help Anatoly out. There's really 2 thoughts of minds of this is, could these people have given any more? They might have been able to have a more quicker and efficient rescue. But at the same time, every bone, every muscle in their body took it just for the kind of advanced crew to be able to get down the mountain and into the tents, and they were completely exhausted. I mean, it's just grueling beyond all imagination. So could they have really dug down deep and gotten any more? I don't know. But anyway, Anatoly goes out on his own. He finds, he gets them all back in kind of 2 waves. Or not them all back, but he gets them back in 2 waves. Mike Groom, Beelman, let's see, Mike Groom, Beelman come back, Sandy Pittman, Cheryl Fox, Tim Madsen, they all make it back, but there's 2 that are essentially in such bad shape that they can't move. One is Namba, Yasaku Namba from Japan. who essentially does eventually die of exposure. And the other one is Beck Weathers, that probably has the craziest story of everybody. So they get back kind of late at night. I don't know if it's like at 1 o'clock in the morning or something like that. They get back to their tents. They're all exhausted. They've been exposed. There's, frostbite. It's just they're more gone than the people that probably even got down there first. But those two were left out. The next day, when the sun starts to come up, there's like a zombie that wanders into the camp. That's Beck Weathers. He had been left overnight, exposed. I think he had taken his glove off. He eventually lost his whole hand. They had to amputate it, as well as huge amounts of frostbite on his nose, and was essentially wandering like a zombie. At which point, when they discover that he's still alive, they get him in a tent and try to save him. Ironically, it being that the tent that they got him into the next night, part of his tent collapsed, but because he was in the tent by himself and the wind was so loud, he had to go through a whole night of him fighting that tent again. It's truly crazy, crazy circumstance. Well, anyway, because of the now everyone's down to base camp that's going to make it. So everyone that's passed away, that's going to pass away, has passed away. So it's Harold Harris, I believe. Yeah, Harold Harris, Rob Hall, and Doug Benson got caught high on the mountain. They all expired in various ways. Scott Fisher got caught, or they all got caught like fairly close to the peak near the Hillary Step. Scott Fisher, he got locked in, like this because of some of the diseases or the parasite he had previously had. That's the theory, and passed away. And then Yumba, I know I'm pronouncing this wrong. Yasuko Namba from Japan passed away. Tragically, not more than a few hundred meters from the tents down at Camp 4. But you have these two terrible cases of Gao Ming Ho, the Taiwanese expedition leader, and Beck Weathers that they have to get down the mountain. So in very tight-knit proximity, also with the help of oxygen from the IMAX iWorks expedition, David Bashir's, very generously, getting these oxygen tanks up to the top, up to Camp 4 are not inexpensive, but because most of the other oxygen from the other expeditions had already been used up, they actually allowed them to use their own oxygen. So they got Beck, and they got, I'm going to just say his first name, Gao, down from Camp 4, Camp 3, in this very sort of like, you'd have like Beck here, and then you'd have like two people directly behind him and directly in front of him, and more or less kind of dragging him down the mountain. But earlier I had said that there was the ice fall, that the Kamba ice fall. Let me get to it. The Kumba ice fall, and Beck and Gao would not be able to make it through there just because of the technical skills required. So they actually had the last sort of daring thing of the whole expedition was a helicopter was flown up to Camp 2. Yeah, Camp 2, above the ice fall. Now the air is so thin here that the helicopter is literally like going like this, and they had to take as much weight as possible out of the helicopter. And it's this little tiny helicopter that can only hold a couple people. I mean, all other helicopters, there's no way that they get up this high. But they essentially get up there. The way that they marked the X for the helicopter to land was with a Kool-Aid that they poured on the snow, a big X on the snow with like a 10-foot X on the snow with Kool-Aid so the helicopter could land. And they got Beck and Gao back down there. Beck's actually become a motivational speaker since this incident had happened. Afterthoughts. I'm going to tell the afterthoughts in the next little bit. All right, you guys.